What I will be talking about is a bit about me, an acknowledgement of country in my own storytelling way, the starting point about Aboriginal overrepresentation in the juvenile justice system and in particular in incarceration. Like flares, things come back into fashion, and I think it's about time we reintroduced a bit of Marxism into this debate. Hence, digging deep, we'll talk about some good Marxist theories: distraction, sanitation, alienation, and a non-Marxist one, racism. Then we'll look at crime rates, lies and statistics, and finally I'll talk about being angry but being effective. And I guess it's true to say that angry I am about the rates of Aboriginal young people in custody throughout Australia. So I left being a magistrate after 22 years. I was a children's court magistrate for all of that time. Of course, I saw Aboriginal overrepresentation right throughout the system. But what I didn't expect when I got appointed to places like Dubbo and working in places like Bourke and Brewarrina was that in some country towns, to this day, there are only Aboriginal young people who come before the courts. Now, they must be the best white kids in the world for that to happen. Of course, there is another conclusion, and that other conclusion I'll be talking about shortly. But it staggered me. It completely staggered me that I could sit in a town for 3 years, towns like Warren, towns like Bourke, towns like Condobolin, and never have a single white kid before me. And talking to children's court magistrates who still sit in those areas, nothing has changed. So that level of overrepresentation in the courts, of course, filters down to overrepresentation in detention centres, which is what I want to focus on today. In terms of acknowledgement of country, I think there is no better place to start and acknowledge the will of Aboriginal people themselves to have this issue dealt with. Because in the Uluru Statement from the Heart, this is the passage, unreadable without crying, so I won't try. But of all the closing the gap issues, the Uluru Statement from the Heart focuses on young people being taken away and locked up in detention. It's the area that pains Aboriginal people most, and why shouldn't it? So I wanted to just explain in my own way my acknowledgement of country. I was sitting in Brewarrina as a magistrate, and there you fly in, and it's an 8-seater plane. Funnily enough, you fly in with the sheriff and the prosecutor and the defence lawyers, and we all fly in and land. And when I got to Brewarrina Court one day, the registrar there said, "You can't lock up any kids because we've got no transport for them." I said, "Well, I will do my very best." Lo and behold, a young person, 16-year-old Aboriginal boy, was arrested, and there was nowhere else for him to go, and he had to be refused bail. So I did, and I thought, well, I'll have to organise transport. And then I go to get on the plane, and there he is, handcuffed to the handrail sitting next to me across the aisle on the 8-seater plane with a policeman behind him. Now, of course, we all know that Brewarrina, I hope you know, is the home of the oldest human structure remaining in the world. 20 times older than the pyramids, which is the fish traps. And you can see them best from the air. So there we go to take off in the plane, and this lad starts shaking, and I turned to him and I said, "Have you been in a plane before?" And he said, "I've not, and I've also never been out of Bree before." And he was terrified. And as the plane started taxiing, he started gagging. So I got my vomit bag out of my seat and held it, because I'm not good with bodily fluids, held it like this, and as the plane took off, he was vomiting, I was holding the bag, and I was looking down at the fish traps and the massive walls. Freeze frame that, because that to me sums up 250 years of colonialisation. Here we are removing an Aboriginal boy from his country in the most foreign way, and there's the magistrate holding the sick bag. I mean, it's just unbelievable, but true. And if I can utilise that story to pay tribute to the Bundjalung people of this country and recognise them as the true owners of this land. So, let's start with just a few stats. What percentage of incarcerated children are Aboriginal? In New South Wales, 45%. And that little number in bracket afterwards, 8, represents the proportion of Aboriginal children in our community. But it also represents all children in our community. So if you take away the ones under 10, then you can see that the rate of overrepresentation is extraordinary. In the Northern Territory, it's 93%. Australia-wide, 85% of those Aboriginal people in custody are on remand. That means they have not been found guilty of anything. And it's 63% for non-Aboriginal children. So I think we can see, the numbers speak for themselves. There is mass overrepresentation. Now, I'm not a psychologist, but I listened with great interest to all of what was spoken about before, and I'm just going to say this because, they're the first things that come to my head. What are the causes of criminal conduct? Trauma, anger, hopelessness. Let's just assume that, that's a lay person's perspective. Is there any evidence anywhere in the world that incarceration helps trauma, anger, or hopelessness? Zero. We are in an evidence-free zone. There is just no evidence that incarcerating people, let alone Aboriginal people, removing them from country, removing them from family. And when I say removing them, we really are. Like the closest detention centre for young people from Tweed Heads is Acmina near Grafton. The closest detention centre from Burke and Brewarrina was Dubbo. We're looking at really removing people, not just from their family, but from their country. And often, for the very first time, they leave their community is to a detention centre. No one can for one moment suggest that the evidence is that incarceration helps in any way with these things. And I'll be returning to that, and you'll be sick of hearing me saying it as we go through. Are there alternatives? $1 million a year, there sure are alternatives. And I heard the last speaker, and I'm sorry I missed the professor from Griffith, saying, well, we've really got to push the economic line. And I agree with her, we do. But criminal justice, and in particular imprisonment and detention, money does not talk. Because if it did talk, we wouldn't have incarceration rates as we do in Australia. If it talked in America, we wouldn't have the most imprisonment. And if it talked in terms of Aboriginal relations and imprisonment, we wouldn't have the most imprisoned race in the world. It makes no economic sense. So let's look at the state-by-state disaster. And I don't want to steal Terry Hutchins' thunder and Binny O'Dwyer's thunder because they're going to be talking about these in some more detail, so a quick scan. There has been overall a drop in young people's offending by virtue of crime rates. The last topic I'll be talking about is crime rates, so we'll return to that, but just keep a little asterisk in your mind when I say that every time. 50% of Queenslanders believe that youth crime is increasing and at crisis point. It's a myth. It's not. 75% of Queenslanders have increased home security in a year. What we're in the middle of is crime hysteria. Organisations like Voice for Victims, who are leading the charge in northern Queensland, are removed from reality, have political agenda, and are pushing this as hard as they can, of course with the media, and we'll come to that in a second. But what's the result? Mass increase of detention of young people. The use of watch houses. Overriding the Human Rights Act. Overriding the measure of last resort. Now, the Canadian gentleman who spoke earlier talked about the ancient origins of the rule that deals with young people in a different way. Well, what's the opposition going to do? Adult crime for adult time. That means life imprisonment for those charged with murder who are young people. That means adult time 10, 15, 20 years for supply of prohibited drugs. That means we are going to see mass increase imprisonment if there's a change of government. But the measure of last resort, that is that detention should only be last resort, was not removed, is not proposed to be removed by the opposition, nor the overriding of the Human Rights Act. That's the current Labor government. That's what they've done in Queensland. And the removal of last resort is the first time I've seen that in any jurisdiction within Australia. Extraordinary. So 85% of this impact is on Aboriginal young people. So in a way, all these changes are, well, not in a way, all these changes are impacting Aboriginal young people way more than any other group in society. And this is the kind of media that we are seeing. All Murdoch press, the main newspapers in all these towns, and look at them, I mean, you know, a lack of originality apart from anything else. But this is the kind of sustained pressure that we're seeing, and the result, just 2 days ago, sick and suicidal children held in police watch houses for weeks without health care, Watchdog reveals. That, of course, is not from the Murdoch press, that's from The Guardian. So, you know, that is what we are looking at. And I guess let's continue our little romp around Australia so that we can all feel better about our wonderful rah-rah Australia. Northern Territory, I love, this particularly leaps so many logical bounds that lowering the age of criminal responsibility will reduce crime. Now, that's what the new Premier-elect has said. I mean, how does that work? If we actually lower the age of criminal responsibility, that will reduce crime. People will feel safer in the community. I mean, really, what we're going to see in the Northern Territory is increasing incarceration, and we are going to see spit hoods back because that's what they've said is going to happen. I also think, and I'll be referring to this shortly, that what we're seeing in Alice Springs is a sanitising or privatising of crime by the introduction of curfews. That is, we remove young people from street crime and think that the problem is solved by putting them back in communities. Now, I was a youth worker before I was a lawyer, but as a magistrate, a lot of the kids I saw out on the street were there for a reason, and that is because it's not safe at home. And not just not safe for them, but for some of them, it's because they don't want to bash their brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, and they're better off out on the street with their mates. So we have a whole range of privatising crime in Alice Springs by taking it into the home. I mean, how 1950s is this? Rather than seeing it out on the street. Note, and other aspects, I know you've got a lot of them, but this one is on sanitising. Western Australia can't keep its young people safe in custody. 2 deaths in 2 months. The last young man to take his life was first incarcerated at age 11 and has spent 5 out of the last 6 birthdays inside. I mean, what does this say about a society that does that to start with, but then can't even keep him safe inside? Where is our responsibility? Where's the state responsibility? We hear a lot about, family violence and people and lack of care and Aboriginal young people being removed from families where they're not safe. Well, they're not safe in state detention. And we know in many cases they're not safe in state care. So, yes, New South Wales, am I through Western Australia? Yes, that'll do. New South Wales has now special bail laws for young people with a special test that only applies to them. And Benny will be talking about that in terms of her coalface experience with the Aboriginal Legal Service. Suffice it to say, of course, to have a special set of bail laws that are tougher than adult laws is, again, unheard of. I've never seen that in my years, and you can see I'm old. Victoria is refusing to raise the age of criminal responsibility as promised because, amongst others, the police commissioner spoke out against it. Now, this is a pattern in Australia that I bet doesn't exist in Canada. Please prove me wrong. And that is that police commissioners feel free. I mean, they're public servants. They're meant to do what the government tells them. They don't make policy. And here we have a police commissioner saying, well, I don't think the age of criminal responsibility should be raised. Well, go and stand for Parliament, mate. You know, what do you think you're doing trying to set public policy against the government of the day, pandering to the Herald Sun in an effort to ensure that more young people are held criminally responsible for their actions? I mean, I've seen it in drug law reform. Consistently, police commissioners speak out against anything to do with drug law reform, and then it gets nowhere because governments feel stuck. I just think that police commissioners should be just like everyone else, every other public servant, not academics, and bound to listen to what Parliament says. So, how are we to make sense of my romp around Australia? Well, firstly, it's not about crime rates. We all know that incarcerating young people does not impact crime rates. And that's because the numbers that get incarcerated are very small in comparison to the big pool of criminal activity out there. And not only that, let's just do, I've done this a million times, so let's just do it once more. Could you please put up your hand if you did not commit any offence, and I mean smoking dope, shoplifting, nude swimming, I don't know, whatever young people do these days, that you did not ever do any crime when you were a young person? Please put up your hand. Okay, there's a couple of goody-goodies here. Yeah, so my point is this. There is a never-ending pool of criminal activity committed by young people. It's there, and the more police you have, as we'll see, the more policing gets done. So it's not about crime rates, that incarceration rates and changes to the law are increasing in respect of young people. It's certainly not about rehabilitation. We know that. And I don't think anybody here in the helping professions needs convincing. It's not about community safety overall. I'm talking here specifically about Aboriginal community safety, because we know the harm that is caused by incarceration when people return. And it's never going to work. You know, in the 1980s, I went to Miami, Florida, where they had just introduced a new drug law about 8 months before, which was called Do Drugs, Do Time. Minimum jail term for possession of any drug, 5 years. And guess what? The newspapers and the shock jocks and the Republicans and some of the Democrats were saying, we've got to increase the penalties, there's still a drug problem. The increased penalty, toughened bail law, lower age of responsibility is an insatiable beast that will never be fed because it doesn't impact on crime. So what you do by pandering to this, Labor governments, is you feeding an insatiable beast that will never be satisfied, and we'll just get worse and worse and worse until, well, can we get worse than the most imprisoned race in the world? I don't know, but it's pretty bad. So this is nothing new. Welcome to the world of prison law reform. It's expensive, it's counterproductive, it's wasteful, and it's hurtful, so we need to ask why we do it. And look, I've listened, and I don't want to pretend that in saying this I'm criticising those who are concentrating on FASD and ADHD and all the rest of it. This is important stuff to reduce harm. But if you're kidding yourself that healing people will actually lower the overall imprisonment rate of Aboriginal young people, I think you're mistaken, and I'll try and explain why. So what is this really about? Well, firstly, it's about distraction. It's about distracting from the crimes of the powerful. Look, just if I can use the environmental example because, you know, I'm a bit green. So Townsville, Cairns, where this is centred in Queensland, we are seeing the death of the Great Barrier Reef, significantly, other causes, but also because of runoff from the sugarcane industry. Do we see much activity on that? In New South Wales, we've just had the biggest fine ever imposed against a government corporation for the 31st breach of logging laws. They're killing koalas, but we don't see that. This is a distraction from the crimes of the powerful. It's also a distraction from private crime. particularly domestic violence and child sex abuse. We all know that if as much attention was paid to domestic violence and child sexual abuse as applied to street crime and antisocial behaviour, I'll come to that in a minute, then we all know that those crimes, but there's no glory in that. There's no visibility in that. This is not the same. So we're privatising crime by this focus on young Aboriginal people, street crimes. We're also distracting from the reality. I talked about hopelessness before, and I saw it from court as a youth worker. I'm sure you've seen it. How am I ever going to buy a house? How am I ever going to get a job? How am I ever going to join this conveyor belt that I so long for when there's this sort of inequality? When the private schools have the best facilities and the public schools get left with the worst. You know, these let alone, don't get me started on gambling and the lack of action on those sorts of social harms, but instead the whole focus, enough is enough. Youth crime's out of control. We need to lock more people up. Read, lock more black young people up. Sanitation. I'm being facetious here, I'm just mimicking what I think people are really thinking. Young Aboriginal people should be in their homes. That's why we bail them. That's why we have curfews. We want them back on the missions, not out on our streets. That's what the hidden message is behind a lot of this. How dare they be so visible? A symbol of what's wrong with our society, that they're so angry, so hopeless, so traumatised that they're acting out in this way. And is it any wonder that in New South Wales there's a new offence called performance crime, which is otherwise known as post-boast? Because what happens is young people are filming their crimes and then putting them up. Well, we can't have that. More visibility, less sanitation, more openness about what's wrong with our society, not so much closed. And alienation. A great Marxist concept usually referred to as workers, but borrowing from that, when we're excluding Aboriginal students at 4 times the rate from schools, that is alienation. When we're excluding them from shopping centres and shopping malls, that is alienation. When 417 Aboriginal children were suspended from school in the first 3, from year kindy to year 2, 417 in 2023. Like, this is alienating a whole group of people from education, the most important years of education. And what we're then doing is, and look, I'm as guilty as everyone, but we're medicalising, we're pathologising their behaviour. Oh, it could be FASD. Oh, it could be ADHD. Oh, it could be trauma. Oh, they've come from bad, families, speech pathology. And these are important things to reduce harm, but they're not going to solve the overrepresentation of Aboriginal people in custody, because that's not the agenda. The agenda is not healing people. It is locking people up. So, I feel better now. I've got that off my chest. And we've all been tiptoeing around, but I'm going to say it. Inherent in this is racism. When you really look at the people behind a lot of the law and order, lock them up organisations, they have links to the racist organisations that have been in existence and simmering not so far below the surface for a long time. We have Trumpism in our midst, and you just have to watch the way he seeks to manipulate race. I see the same in Peter Dutton. I see the same in politicians around Australia of all ilks. There is codified language being used when really they mean black kids. And we need to call it out. You don't get to be the most imprisoned race in the world without there being racism. You don't get those sorts of levels of overrepresentation of Aboriginal people in custody without not just institutionalised racism, but individualised racism right through the criminal justice system, from the police to the courts to juvenile justice agencies, right through. So, and this, I was talking with our Canadian friend, Australia's first reaction to social ills is imprisonment. And I think that's because we're a penal colony. So, there's too much littering, lock them up. There's kids out on the street, lock them up. Oh, I forgot to mention my pet hate, which is antisocial behaviour. You know, this was not a term 10 years ago. And suddenly we have this thing, we've got to cut down on antisocial behaviour. Why? You know, to me, antisocial behaviour is like farting in a lift. That's antisocial behaviour. I mean, what are they actually talking about? It's somewhat less than a crime, because otherwise they'd say crime. But when they say antisocial behaviour, they mean social behaviour that they don't like. And what do we call that? We call that drinking in the street. We call it socialising. We call it, you know, doing things that people do that other people don't like. That's antisocial behaviour, but it's not a crime. And it needs to be called out as sort of one of these bullshit terms. Okay. So, let's return, if we can, to crime rates. And this is my highly academic terminology for crime rates. I think that why we actually believe it whenever anyone says the crime rate is increasing is beyond me. Let's analyse it this way. Imagine you've got a town called Burke, and there's a big publicity campaign by the local paper, and the Murdoch Press sends out people there, and the Australian runs a few stories, and the shock jocks do the same thing. There's a crime wave, young people. So what do? They send more police out there. And what happens when they send more police out there? They do something. Remember I talked to the unfathomable deep pool of young people and crime? Well, they dip into that pool in more depth. And guess what happens then? The crime rate goes up because there's more arrests and there's more people going to court. And what happens then? Oh my God, we need more police. We need more police. And what happens when we get more police? And you get this absolute spiral impact, and all based on a falsity, which is crime rates. Crime rates are merely a reflection of police activity and police choice. So what we get is a crime wave manufactured by the very agency that has most to gain, which is, we've got a crime wave, we need more police. And this is, you only have to, and I haven't done the analysis, but others much more academic than me have, of the actions of the police union in highlighting crime in an effort to increase police numbers. And you know, you get to the insane situation we're in Burke, this is true, where they've removed most of the youth workers and just replaced them with police. And what do they do then? Say we need a police youth agency. And that's what they do. They set up police youth agencies in the town because police are youth workers. No, it doesn't work like that. So we have this insane thing about crime stats that just really makes no sense. And the way it's reported implicates in my view, implicates the police in a self-serving spiral of increasing hysteria about crime, because it's in their interests. And it's certainly in the interests of the opposition and the shock jock media to keep it going because of distraction, sanitation, alienation, and racism. So, I didn't want to only be negative, but there is a glimmer of hope. For example, in Lismore at the moment, there is a patrol commander whose overwhelming sensibility has determined that, well, actually, it's better that we treat dolly incapacts as an issue at the time of assessment, that we don't just arrest, that we use our discretion, and guess what? The crime rate goes down. Now, this is an extraordinary thing because these days, police actually get brownie points for crime rates going down. This we need to feed. We need to actually encourage a mature approach. And I saw it when I was sitting in Western New South Wales. There was some police areas where, guess what? There was no kids coming before the court. We were nearly like New Brunswick. And we were nearly in a situation where, hey, there's no kids from this town locked up. And it was a policing choice. And funnily enough, they got brownie points for it. So that's something we really need to encourage. So, being angry and being effective. How do we be effective in this scenario? I think it's by asking one question. Where's the evidence for that? Where's the evidence that lowering the age will decrease crime? Where's the evidence that changing bail laws in New South Wales will make the community safer? Where's the evidence that, that locking young people in Queensland up in watch houses will actually have any impact on the safety of communities in Townsville and Cairns? Because, of course, the answer is there is no evidence for any of it. And do you notice the dichotomy? Anything we do, when I say we, broadly, all of us, like evidence-based research or saying we need to test more people for this, that or the other because we can treat them differently, or perhaps we should... They all say, well, where's the evidence for it? It's the first thing they say, and we have to go out, we have to do pilot programs, they have to be evaluated. Where's the evaluation of locking kids up in detention? Zero. Where's the evidence base that lowering the age will... I mean, I can't even believe that I'm saying that, will make communities safer. Where is the evidence for any of this? And there's none. So to be angry but be effective is to question them and say, where's the evidence that any of this will work? And I spend a lot of my time saying that. Of course, you know, it doesn't actually do anything else. So I don't want to discourage anybody from doing the kind of incredibly supportive work that I've heard here in terms of supporting young people through this horrible journey. But I am saying don't kid yourself that this will overall impact favourably on what we're seeing and is a much bigger problem. And support each other. That's what the importance of things like this is, Meg, is that people get an opportunity to come together and say, we're all in this boat together, we all care about young people, particularly our First Nations people being locked up in such horrendous numbers. And of course, finally, the other answer is to study law at SCU and change the world.